The year was 1793. The United States of America, a mere 17 years into its existence, was a nation without a permanent home for its government. For a full decade, the founders had been locked in a bitter stalemate over where to place the capital city. The ambitions of New York clashed with the claims of Philadelphia, while Virginians staunchly advocated for a site along the Potomac River, far enough south to prevent the northern states from wielding undue influence over the new federal authority. The resolution, as was often the case with these men, was forged not in a grand hall, but over a private dinner. Alexander Hamilton secured his coveted plan for the federal government to assume state debts, and in exchange, Thomas Jefferson obtained the promise of a capital on the Potomac. This fateful bargain was struck at a dinner table in New York City during the summer of 1790. What they acquired for their deal was a 10-mile square patch of land straddling the Virginia-Maryland border, a wilderness of swamps and dense second-growth forest. It was a place devoid of roads, stone quarries, a local population, or a workforce. To design it, they hired Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, a French engineer who conceived a grand vision: a grid of city streets bisected by dramatic diagonal avenues, all radiating from two majestic focal points, a house for the president and a capitol building perched upon a modest hill overlooking the river. L'Enfant, however, was dismissed before he could raise a single structure. His refusal to share his blueprints with the project's commissioners and his unilateral decision to demolish the home of a politically connected landowner because it lay in the path of his grand avenue proved to be his undoing. George Washington himself sanctioned his firing. The commissioners who took over inherited not only L'Enfant's ambitious design, but also a monumental challenge. They had a strict deadline: construct a functional seat of government for a nation that was scheduled to relocate there by 1800, a mere 7 years away. This meant building a capital, a presidential residence, federal office buildings, bridges and roads, all on terrain that was largely a mosquito-infested bog overgrown with young timber. Their greatest obstacle: they were practically destitute. The congressional appropriation for the entire project was laughably insufficient. The commissioners' primary strategy to raise funds was to sell plots of land in the new city. The problem was that no one was eager to purchase real estate in a swamp. George Washington himself rode down from Mount Vernon to personally appeal to speculators and investors. Almost all of them declined, so the commissioners turned to the standard practice for major American construction projects of that brutal era. When the work was punishing and the wages were too low to attract willing laborers, they leased enslaved people. I have spent considerable time with the Commissioner of Public Buildings records. The surviving ledgers, meticulously kept, are housed in the National Archives. Written in the elegant, tight copperplate script of an 18th-century clerk, these pages are filled with columns of figures: wages disbursed, materials acquired, work completed, and woven through every single page, an inescapable presence, are the entries for enslaved laborers. They are listed only by their first names alongside the names of their owners. This was because the commissioners weren't paying the workers themselves, they were paying their masters. If you have any interest in the actual human beings who constructed the edifice meant to house American democracy, the men who hewed the stone, hauled the bricks, and mixed the mortar, whose names are absent from every plaque and memorial inside that building, please subscribe to Erased Labor right now. This channel's existence depends on subscribers. Click that button and return, because what I discovered within those aged ledger pages is a story that no official tour guide recounts, and it has been lying in those archives for over 2 centuries. To grasp the full weight of this story, you must first understand the context. By 1793, slavery was not a peripheral element of the American economy. It was the very engine that drove it. The tobacco fields of Virginia, the rice plantations of South Carolina, the indigo operations of Georgia, all of it was built on the backs of enslaved people. And the new capital was planted squarely in the heart of this slave-holding world. The 10-mile square was carved from Virginia and Maryland, both slave states. The men who owned the land upon which the city was being built were slaveholders. The commissioners overseeing the project were Virginians, intimately familiar with the labor dynamics of their region. When they needed workers, they knew precisely where to turn. They placed advertisements in local newspapers, one of which I have found transcribed in a 19th-century history of the city's founding. These ads called for Negro carpenters, bricklayers, sawyers, and common laborers to be hired out by their owners to the public buildings commissioners at a fixed monthly rate. A skilled enslaved carpenter, for instance, might command a rate of about $5 a month, paid directly to the owner. Common laborers brought in less. The man doing the grueling work never saw a cent of that money. These enslaved workers were sourced from plantations in Alexandria, Georgetown, and the nearby countryside. Some were brought from further afield, leased out in groups, 5 men here, a dozen there. Seasonal contracts were renewed at the owner's whim, and the work continued without pause. At the peak of the building seasons between 1795 and 1800, estimates derived from the Commissioner's own records place the number of enslaved individuals working on the Capitol site alone at approximately 400 to 600 men per season. The exact number fluctuates depending on how historians interpret the often incomplete records. What is unmistakably clear, however, is that enslaved labor was not a minor addition to this project. It was its very foundation. They were assigned the most grueling tasks. First, there was the land to be cleared. Jenkins Hill, the modest rise upon which William Thornton's winning design for the Capitol would eventually stand, was covered in a thick tangle of old trees and brush. The timber had to be felled, the stumps wrenched from the earth and the terrain levelled. A force of 80 men, armed with axes and saws and using ox-drawn chains, accomplished this over the course of 1793 and into 1794. Next came the grading and the digging of the foundation trenches, which were cut 4 feet deep through the hill's clay and decomposed sandstone. These trenches had to be perfectly straight, with vertical walls constantly checked against surveyors' stakes. A proper stone foundation requires an absolutely level and even footing. The men who carved these trenches did so by hand with iron spades under the oppressive July heat of a Potomac summer. Then the brickwork began. The Capitol consumed millions of bricks over its 7-year construction. These bricks were manufactured on site, in kilns erected on the eastern side of the building grounds. The process was simple yet physically destructive. Men dug the clay, then puddled it with water until it reached the perfect pliable consistency. They pressed it into wooden molds, 1 brick at a time, striking the top smooth with a wet rag before turning the green brick out to dry in the sun for several days. Finally, they stacked it in the kiln, hundreds at a time, and fired it for 48 to 72 hours, constantly feeding the flames with wood. The fire had to be hot enough to vitrify the clay, but not so hot that it would crack the finished bricks. A skilled burner could gauge the temperature simply by the color of the flames licking out of the kiln's vents. The enslaved men manning these kilns worked in exhausting 12-hour shifts. The summer of 1797 was one of the most brutal on record for Washington. A contractor's assistant, who wrote a brief account of the work for a Philadelphia newspaper, noted that the brick burners toiled through the night by firelight and that several men had to be relieved mid-shift because of the suffocating heat. He recorded their output, 12,000 bricks from one kiln in just 4 days, but he did not record a single one of their names, and then there was the stone. The Capitol was constructed using sandstone quarried at Aquia Creek, approximately 40 miles south down the Potomac in Virginia. This pale, buff-colored sandstone is soft enough to be shaped with hand tools and had been a popular building material for Virginia manor houses for generations. The commissioners contracted with quarry operators who were to supply dressed stone to their exact specifications. These quarry operators, in turn, relied on enslaved workers to do the actual cutting. The method for cutting dressed building stone in 1795 was essentially the same as it had been for a millennium. First, you identified the stone's grain, the direction in which it would split most cleanly. Then you drilled a line of holes with a hand drill, a steel bit driven by a wooden mallet, each hole 2 or 3 inches deep and spaced 6 inches apart along the intended split line. You drove iron feathers and wedges into these holes, tightening them in sequence until the stone cracked cleanly along the line. Next came the dressing, using a chisel and mallet, stroke by stroke, to flatten the faces and bring them to the required squareness. A dressed face on a piece of building stone had to be true to within 1/8 of an inch. Any block that was even slightly out of square would show in the finished wall. The mortar joints would be uneven, and the courses of stone would drift off level. An experienced stonecutter could feel a flawed face with his fingertips before he even measured it. A fragment of an overseer's log from the Aquia Creek quarry, dating to the summer of 1797, survives in a Maryland County deed book, where it was entered as evidence in a later property dispute. It recounts the work in the flat, unemotional language of a man tallying production. Stone cut this week, 47 feet face measure. Stone lost to cracking, 6 feet. Men present, 14. Men absent, sick, 2. 14 men cutting 47 feet of dressed sandstone in a single week in July, working iron chisels and wooden mallets under the blazing Virginia sun. The 2 men absent sick are not named in the fragment. They are recorded merely as number 1 and number 2, the quarry's system for identifying its enslaved workers. I have no way of knowing what ailed them. Quarry work produced clouds of stone dust that coated the lungs, leaving men coughing and gasping by the end of a month. The creek nearby served as both the source of drinking water and the dumping ground for human waste and refuse. Waterborne illness swept through these encampments every summer. Cuts from flying stone chips often turned septic in the ferocious heat. The fragment makes no mention of a contractor's doctor. Number 1 and Number 2, absent for 2 days, were back in the count of 14 the following week. The stone they cut that summer, and in the summers before and after, is still embedded in the walls of the United States Capitol right now. Before I tell you about the 2 men I managed to find by name in the commissioner's ledgers, and what the records reveal about their fates after the construction ended, please do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. The algorithm tends to bury these kinds of stories unless enough people signal they want to see them. 1 click and then come back. Because the stories of the men I found in those ledgers are the ones that I keep returning to, long after I've closed the archives for the day, I want to tell you about Len. He appears in the Commissioner's payroll records, identified as the property of James Hoban. Hoban was the Irish-born architect who designed the President's house and oversaw the construction of both the presidential mansion and the Capitol. He had arrived in America as an indentured carpenter, made his reputation in Charleston, and later came to Washington with capital, influential connections, and several enslaved workers he had brought up from South Carolina. Len was among them. The records list him as a carpenter. His name appears across multiple building seasons, 1795, 1796, 1797, and into 1798. His entries are linked to the finished carpentry on the Capitol's interior, floor framing, the installation of window and door casings, the fine, detailed work that comes only after the rough structural frame is complete. Finished carpentry is a highly skilled trade. It demands the ability to read architectural drawings, transfer measurements with precision, cut complex joints that fit perfectly without gaps, and understand how wood behaves as it reacts to changes in moisture and temperature. A man who lacked these skills would never have been assigned to such work. Hoban received $5 a month on Len's behalf. The entries are recorded in the same steady handwriting, the same ink, the same matter-of-fact accounting style as entries for sand, lime, and iron nails. I searched for Len beyond those payroll records, hoping to trace his life after the project. He does not appear in any manumission deed for the District of Columbia. He does not appear in any census record under Hoban's household that I was able to find. He does not appear in Hoban's will, which was probated in 1831. The most likely explanation is that Hoban sold him at some point after the Capitol construction work concluded. The sale records for enslaved people in Alexandria and Georgetown during that period are incomplete and fragmentary. He could be anywhere within them, his name lost to history. He built the floors and window casings of the United States Capitol. He is not named anywhere inside it. The second man I want you to know about is listed in the records as Daniel. He is identified as the property of Notley Young, a Georgetown landowner and merchant. Young was one of the principal original proprietors of the land for the new capital city, owning a significant portion of the territory the government purchased for the federal district and being compensated accordingly. He was also compensated by the commissioners for the use of Daniel across at least 3 working seasons. What makes Daniel's story particularly compelling is that his labor classification in the records changes over time. In 1796, he is listed simply as a common laborer, but in 1797 and 1798, his entries are associated specifically with masonry work. He learned something on that job site. Masonry, laying brick and stone in level courses, mixing mortar to the proper consistency, reading a plumb line, and building corners that remain perfectly square, is a skilled trade. You do not simply stumble into it. Someone on that site took the time to show Daniel what they were doing, or Daniel possessed the intelligence and determination to watch and teach himself. By his 3rd season, he was performing the work well enough to be classified differently in the official payroll. When the Capitol construction began winding down, Daniel returned to Notley Young's property. Young died in 1802. His estate inventory, which I found transcribed in Maryland probate records, the pages dry and brown at the edges, lists enslaved people by first name and estimated value. There is a Daniel on that list, valued at $300. $300 was a high valuation for 1802. It reflected a man with specialized, highly valuable skills. Whether it is the same Daniel from the Capitol payroll, I cannot state with absolute certainty. The name was common enough. But the valuation fits, the geography fits, and the timeline fits. $300. A man who had helped build the capital of the United States, assessed at $300 in a dead merchant's estate, and sold to settle his owner's debts, Sotzebor. I keep asking you because the part that comes next, the burning, the rebuilding, and what the Congress that met in that building did and, more importantly, did not do to account for the labor that built it, is the part I want you to stay for. The British burned the capital on the night of August 24, 1814. A force of British soldiers under Admiral George Cockburn entered the city after the American militia broke and ran at the Battle of Bladensburg. Cockburn walked into the Senate chamber and, with theatrical cruelty, held a mock vote on whether to burn the building. The motion passed. His men piled up furniture, books, and anything else that would catch fire, doused it with gunpowder, and put a torch to it. The sandstone walls cracked and spalled in the intense heat. The wooden roof structure was entirely consumed. The Library of Congress, with its roughly 3,000 volumes, was reduced to ashes. The chambers, the committee rooms, the corridors, everything that could burn was gone. A violent thunderstorm that night helped save the outer shell. The rain came down in sheets, dousing the flames before the weakened stone superstructure could collapse entirely. When the commissioners surveyed the damage the next morning, the walls were still standing, scorched, cracked in places, blackened with soot but undeniably standing. The same Aquia Creek sandstone that the unnamed quarryman had cut from the Virginia hillside in 1797 had held. They rebuilt. The reconstruction began almost immediately. Irish craftsmen were brought down from Philadelphia. Local stonecutters were called back to repair the damaged walls, and enslaved laborers were rented again because the legal structure of the nation had not changed and would not change for another 50 years. The records for the reconstruction are significantly less complete. Several of the commissioners' files were themselves burned or damaged in the attack. But what survives shows the exact same pattern: hired out enslaved carpenters and bricklayers, listed only by their first names, with wages paid directly to their owners. By 1819, the building was functional once more. A new low dome had been constructed over the central rotunda. The chambers were restored. Congress resumed its business. Here is the thought that keeps circling in my mind every time I read those records from beginning to end. The men who built this building did skilled, precise, demanding work. The bricklayers laid courses that survived a fire intentionally set by a professional army. The stonecutters dressed blocks to within 1/8 of an inch, and the walls those blocks went into are still standing more than 2 centuries later. The carpenters framed floors and fitted casings that served for decades before being replaced, not because they had failed, but because the building was expanded. This was not unskilled labor performed under duress, nothing more. These were craftsmen who knew their trades and practiced them with remarkable skill under conditions that would have killed many of the men who later sat in the comfortable chambers above their foundations. They were compensated nothing for any of it. The country that assembled in that building went on to become the wealthiest nation in human history. The commerce it enabled, the laws it shaped, the institutions it built, all administered from a structure whose very foundations were laid by men who were themselves considered legal property. That is not rhetoric. That is precisely what the yellowed ledger pages show. In 2000, as part of the Capitol Visitor Center project, the architect of the Capitol's office finally commissioned a formal research project into the enslaved labor used in the building's construction. Historians work through the same commissioner's records I've been studying. A scholar named Jesse Holland published a book on the subject in 2007. The findings were not disputed. The evidence was there in the archives, waiting all along. A plaque was installed in the Capitol Visitor Center. It is in a corridor. It is small. Most visitors walk right past it without stopping. The building has had more work done to it than almost any other structure in America. The iconic dome you see today was constructed of cast iron in the 1850s and 1860s. The east and west fronts were extended in the 1950s and 1960s. The building you walk through today is significantly larger than the one John Adams first moved into in 1800. But the lower courses of the original walls are still there. Inside the foundation corridors you can still see the old Aquia Creek sandstone, that pale buff colored stone that came up the Potomac on barges from the quarry below Fredericksburg. It has been painted over more than once, patched where the 1814 fire cracked it, but it is there holding. The men who cut it are not commemorated anywhere in the building that rests on their work. There is no plaque for Len, the Finnish carpenter who worked for $5 a month directly into James Hoburn's pocket for 4 building seasons. No marker for Daniel the laborer who taught himself enough masonry to earn a higher payroll classification, and was valued at $300 when his owner's estate was settled. No monument for number 1 and number 2 at the Aquia Creek quarry. Absent sick, in the log for 2 days in July 1797, back in the count of 14 the week after. No names on any wall for any of the 400 to 600 enslaved men who worked on this building in its first 7 years. In the architect of the Capitol's conservation collection, there is a mason's hammer recovered during renovation work on the Capitol's original foundation corridor. An iron head with a rotted wooden handle found wedged behind one of the original sandstone blocks during a 1990s repair project. The conservator who found it estimated its age at 150 to 230 years, based on the style of the ironwork. It was put behind that stone by a man whose name is not recorded. The stone is still holding. If you've stayed with me this far, please subscribe. Tell the algorithm that there are people who want to hear about the men and women that the official version of the story leaves out. I'll keep looking for them as long as you tell the algorithm you're here. I'm glad you stayed with me. The United States Capitol began construction in 1793. It was constructed with the labor of between 400 and 600 enslaved African American workers alongside Irish craftsmen, free black laborers, and local hired hands. Completed, burned in 1814, rebuilt, expanded, still in use. The men who built it are not on the tour.